Before growing orchids, you should learn about the types of roots of these plants, as this greatly affects the understanding of their care. It's a Sprouted Seeds YouTube channel. Subscribe and let's get started. There are such types of roots. Thin-rooted orchids. They are spidery and delicate. Thick-rooted orchids. Thick-rooted orchids look more like young string beans. Adventitious orchid roots, keikis. In reality, adventitious roots aren't roots at all. Instead, they produce keikis, or tiny new orchid plants, which are used as a means of orchid self-propagation. Keiki roots can be carefully taken out and replanted in suitable orchid media, or they can be attached to a suitable host rock or piece of wood. Aerial roots. Air roots get their name because of how they grow. Orchid roots frequently grow straight up into the air, in contrast to most plant roots that usually grow straight down into the soil or potting media, and remain mostly below ground and unseen. Although air roots have a different appearance than other plant roots, they serve the same purpose and ought to be left in their original location with appropriate care. Which orchids have aerial roots? Not all orchid plants will develop aerial roots. There are three main ways that orchids grow: in the ground, on trees, and on rocks. Terrestrial orchids. The least likely orchids to grow aerial roots are these ones. Like normal plant roots, terrestrial orchid roots are usually buried in the potting. A few of the most famous and popular terrestrial orchid species are Cymbidium, Cypripedium or lady slipper, Callan, and Dactyl or Hiza or marsh. Tree-growing orchids. Epiphytic orchids are orchids that grow on trees. A lot of species of epiphytic orchids prefer the trunks or limbs of trees in the wild. In a greenhouse setting, popular mounting media include corkboard, tree limbs, driftwood, hardwood, and other organic matter. The most common and well-known of the orchids that grow on trees is the enormously popular Phalaenopsis. Cattleya and Dendrobium are two other common types of orchids that grow in trees. Orchids of this kind have aerial roots. Since chopping off live, viable aerial roots essentially means cutting off the orchid's life support system, it is imperative to avoid doing so. Rock-growing orchids. Lithophytic orchids are orchids that grow on rocks. These orchids are typically tropical species that grow in the wild on suitably exposed rocks. In order to maintain stability, these orchids grow roots that twine around their rock hosts. They also frequently burrow into voids or cracks in the rock itself. Three well-known species of rock-growing orchids include Dendrobium, Bifrenaria, and Maxillaria. How to know if your orchid roots are healthy. Take note of the various root layers on the orchid. Velamen makes up the outermost layer of an orchid's roots. A porous root covering that absorbs nutrients and moisture is called velamen. Once inside, these nutrients filter down to the vascular tissue, which is the orchid's version of blood vessels. Moisture and nutrients are transported from the roots to the actual plant by the vascular tissue. Although the length, width, and number of roots on a healthy orchid plant can vary, they all have some essential traits in common. The tips of them will be green, or sometimes red. The velamen covering will typically feel spongy and be white or silvery in color. This section begins at the root's base and grows outward to meet the red or green tip. It is essential that the roots are round, plump, white or silver in color, with tips that are green or reddish. How to spot unhealthy orchid roots. Spotting unhealthy roots is easier with epiphytic and lithophytic orchid species since the roots are easily visible. Here are some common signs of unhealthy orchid roots. All of the roots are silver or white. A root that completely whitens and loses its green or red tip indicates that it is no longer growing. These roots can be carefully removed with scissors or a sterilized cutting knife. The roots are soft, brown, and mushy. The most common cause of brown, mushy roots in orchids is either root rot or mold growth. The most frequent cause is excessive watering. Eliminate any areas of the plant or leaves that have developed root rot, as well as the diseased, decaying roots. Always sterilize your knife or cutting shears before doing this. Then sterilize a new pot and add fresh potting media before replanting the orchid. Dry, flat, shriveled orchid roots. When the roots are flat, dry, shriveled looking, this often means the orchid has not received enough moisture. Caring for orchids is not difficult, but you should know some information about your plant to properly care for it.